Okay, so I'm going to create that project 4 on my desktop where we're going to deal with our APIs. And as far as our view is concerned, we're going to have two pieces of information, or two user interface elements. Text box for their zip code, and then a search button. And I guess maybe a label as well. So here's a label prompting the user for their zip code. A text field. And then a search button. And I'm going to go ahead and embed those all in a stack view. And I'm going to take the stack view and make it have equal widths. And I guess I should probably constrain it that looks terrible, but it is what it is. Look, if you want it to look good, you're going to have to hire someone else. That's not my job.
You sit here and watch you struggle with constraints and just feel better about yourself.
So I was, again, listening to a podcast, and it's like an entrepreneur podcast, and one of their things was, know what you're good at, right? Like, I can spend 18 hours in a day trying to make this design look good, and it's not going to look good. That doesn't mean I was productive, right? Just because I was working on it for 18 hours and I didn't stop working on it, like, it still looks like garbage at the end of the 18 hours. Like, I would have been better off spending my time hiring someone else to do it and actually getting it done over those 18 hours. Like, my time would be more productive allocating that to someone else. And I know that now, right? Like, we've all done that. Like, it's called programmer art, and it's not very good. Okay, so I need references to the text field. I need reference to the button. So I'm going to go ahead and use the assistant editor. I'm going to grab the text field. So this will be my zip code text field. And then all the magic's going to happen on the button click. So I'm going to call this Go Touched. And I want it to be an action. Nothing's happening in the view did load, so I'm getting rid of that. Okay, so we have our interface. We have our method that's going to get triggered. Life's good, right? Okay, so then I'm going to need access to that API. Okay, so if I go back over, I'm going back to the first API because what we want to work through today is how do I get this latitude and longitude coordinate from this API? Okay, so I know that this is the URL that I want. Okay, so I'm going to have a variable called location URL equal to a new URL where I'm passing in this URL. I've hard-coded the parameters. Don't hard-code the parameters. Right? Probably want those at least as variables, and then you can escape them into a string. But I've hard-coded them for now. It's this URL wants a string label. So from that string, I'm creating a URL. Why is it not liking that? It's lowercase string. Okay. The book actually walks you through creating an extension method for a class, saying, hey, given these key value pairs, let's create this query string. Does everyone know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about query strings? So I have key value pairs at the end of a URL. So I'm making an HTTP GET request. Everything that's coming after the question mark is part of that query string. and then just matching key value pairs. So the book actually talks about an extension method, like I'm going to extend a class definition, and it's extending it by saying, if you add this method, which takes a parameter of key value pairs, it automatically builds that query string onto your URL. So it's kind of an interesting way to handle it. Another way you could handle it is just using that string interpolation. Okay, so I'm just hard coding it for now. What I want to do though is I want to make a request out to this URL. Okay, this is actually pretty straightforward. I'm going to create a data task. So I'm going to create a variable called location task. It's going to go from my URL session.shared.data task with a URL. So my URL is going to be my location URL. And this, why is it? Oh, it's saying that I may not have a URL. It's optional. So I'm going to fix that so that it's not optional. Just putting it in that conditional. Okay, the way this location task or this data task works is it's going to take a closure, which is going to determine what should I do when I get my data back, when I encounter an error. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I don't think there is. There's a response which gives you a status code, I guess. So this is going to take a closure for those completion events. Like what happens when you encounter an error? What happens when you get your response object? And your response object, you can look at different status codes and things like that. And then when you get your data. Okay, so this closure is going to take 3 pieces of information. It's going to take your data, your response object, and then an error. Those are the 3 incoming parameters. And then I have to do something with them. So I'm saying here's the start of my function definition. So here's the incoming parameters to my closure. And then in is going to provide my function definition. Is everyone okay with that? This is from last week, kind of a review. I have 3 parameters. Because I have 3 parameters, they have to be in parentheses. And then the in, I'm comparing this to JavaScript now. This would be like that big arrow. So I have 3 parameters coming in to a function, that big arrow being the function. The in is kind of that big arrow. And then I'm going to give you the function definition. Okay? So what I'm going to do is if I can assign a variable to my data, if I have data, that's a data object, then I should be able to, let's just convert it to a string first. Okay, so I'm going to say if string response is equal to a string with the data from data, and then I have to specify which type of encoding I want. Then I'm going to print the string response. Value is defined but never used. There we go. Everyone with me so far? Okay, in order for this location task object to actually go out and retrieve my data from my API, so based on this location URL, I have to basically send the request. So in the JavaScript world, we'd say send or fetch, whichever API you're using. In the iOS world, we're going to take this location task and we're going to resume it. It's bizarre to me that it's resume, but Start it by resuming it. Yeah.
It's, like I said, everything else I've learned in iOS is backwards. So sure, let's go with that.
Yep, I think it's backwards too in this case. Like even after dealing with it for quite a while, like it's backwards. So I go ahead and run this, and what I'm expecting is to see the response from the server. Like I'm expecting to see my JSON data now. And my constraints are screwed up.
It's there.
Right? It's there. I could probably click on it. I'll fix it in a second here. But if I click on it, I don't even know if I can click on it. It doesn't look like I'm able to depress it. So it looks like I got to fix the constraints first.
Well, even then, where are you displaying it to? You don't have an output.
I didn't print it.
You printed the console.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I thought I printed it. So I'm just going to take this stack view, and I want it centered in the container. Got the wrong key. Center horizontally, center vertically. It shouldn't be off the screen. It's not where I want it, but for this demo, it's fine. Okay, so when I hit go, I'm trying to print, and I get an error. App transport security has blocked the clear text HTTP resource load since it's insecure. So by default, your data requests are only going to go to HTTPS services, which is great in theory, right? Like, I mean, it's there for a reason. Like, I want my application to be secure. They don't have an API that's HTTPS based. Okay, so again, I intentionally chose this API because you're going to deal with services. There's nothing sensitive about the weather information. I don't know that it needs to be over SSL. Like, I would argue that the API is right here, and my phone still wants to access that API even though it's not over SSL. Okay, so it's easy to add that SSL key if I'm that API provider, but they don't have it. So let's fix our code. Like, we're going to run into this. So in order to do that, I'm going to go to the info.plist. And this user interface sucks, to be honest with you. What I want to do is I want to add a new row for this app transport security. So the way I add a new row is I cursor over the last row, and then these plus and minus icons show up. Like, so when I say the user interface sucks, this is what I'm talking about. Is like, how do you add a new row? And you're sitting here and you have no idea. So you cursor over the row, I hit that plus sign, and then it'll add a new row, and then it puts you into that row, and it says, here's all the available options that you could set. So it's the application transport security. And I don't think it searches. Thank you. And it's a dictionary, so I have to go into the dictionary, and again, like, even I'm confused about how you get into the dictionary. Like, there's one item in the dictionary, so I want to expand this, and then I think I can get into the dictionary. Yeah, there's no items, but I can add a new item. Now I'm in, like, so I hit the plus minus for the app transport security because it's a dictionary. It creates a dictionary key value pair. So it didn't create a new row because it knew that that item that I was clicking on, that plus minus, was a dictionary. Then it says, okay, what do I want to do? I want to allow arbitrary loads, and I want to change this from no to yes. I mean, there's really not anything to it. It's just the interface sucks.
I didn't even notice these arrows until...
Yeah. Like, so if you try to click over here to change from yes to no, it doesn't allow you to. Like, it eventually highlights the whole thing, but it doesn't allow you to actually toggle between yes and no. And I'm the one that's bad at user interface design. Like, I mean, come on. Apple's supposed to be the experts, right?
Well, this isn't for the general public.
It's true.
Probably written by developers.
It's true. So now if I run this, now that I have that info.plist setting, now I expect to actually see my zip code data. And again, I have it hard-coded, so it doesn't matter that I didn't type anything into the zip code field. I have my data. And like if I was a jerk about things, I'd say, oh, we talked about encoding and decoding JSON data last week. Just decode this data. Right? Like you did it last week. This is a little bit different, right? Like take a look at this JSON data. Like now I have this label on top of my object, right? Like I have this postal codes. What I really want is in that array, but I have that label in front of it. So do I really want a JSON object that's my postal code? And I'd argue I don't. So I want to walk through this example because like I think it's too relevant to what you are going to end up doing in the real world to skip over it because it's not necessarily that straightforward. So initially, I was like, yeah, we'll cover this and we'll cover gesture recognizers and we'll have plenty of time tonight. And then I was going through it for the project. I'm like, no, we're not going to have plenty of time tonight. Like this decoding is a pain and I didn't really show you how to do this. So like I think it makes sense once we start doing it. But what I want to do is I want to create a class definition for my location information. Okay, so I'm going to create a new class. It's going to be a Swift file called location. It's going to be a class definition called location. It's going to implement a couple interfaces, right? So it's going to implement the codable interface because we want to be able to encode and decode it. It's going to implement the custom string convertible so that we can get like a description, so kind of our toString method. Right, and it's saying, hey, you need to have a description. So eventually we'll have a description for our location. Cool location. Okay. So far, so good. Our class definition, what we care about, I guess, is completely up to us, but I know I need a latitude and longitude. Okay, so I have latitude, I have longitude. I'm going to have those variables. As a double. And longitude as a double. And then, like I would argue we might want like a location text for Verona. And if we're talking about zip codes, I don't think other countries use zip codes, right? Something similar, but I know Canada does something different, and so like if I assume that we're in the U.S., I might care about like the admin name being the state. Okay, so if we just assume, so I'm restricting my searches based on U.S. zip codes, then I know that I'm going to have that admin name being a state, so I'll have another variable for the state. And those are the only things that I care about for my location information. So I want to take this JSON data and convert it, when I decode it, I want to convert it into location objects that have the information that I'm suggesting. Okay? So far, so good? What do we need to do next? So we did this last week. Yeah, so
We got to tell it what the JSON key is to do.
yeah, so I got to map JSON keys to properties, right? Okay, and I don't even care how we do this right now, but I just want you to kind of have big picture, like how do I do this? So if you go out and do a Google search, like you know you're going to have to do that, right? Like if you do a Google search, map JSON keys to properties, you're going to see that I created an enumerated type of those mappings. Okay, you're just going to see that. Okay, so you'll be able to find it. What else do I need to do? Yeah, so JSON.parse, like essentially I need to, like, hey, given this JSON, like now it's time to create an instance of a location object, right? I need to define my init from a decoder. So basically my init method's going to get called. So when I initialize an instance of a location, I have to be able to initialize it with a decoder. So I'm going to have a JSON decoder to decode location objects. So I really need to have an init from decoder. Okay, and we can put that in. So if I say, here's my init method, I think it's from decoder. I think that's the method signature. Yeah, and it's forcing me to have this as required. So, yep. Okay, now it's complaining that I haven't initialized all the properties. Fine. No problem. My mapping. I'm going to have an enumerated type, location keys, that conforms to the string coding key format. And the way I want this to work is I'm going to have my property mapped to a specific JSON field. Okay, so my property is latitude, and I know that it's going to be just LAT in the JSON data. I know that my property is longitude. I know that it's going to map to just LNG in the JSON data. So I'm going to have that mapping. I don't have anything that's mapped the same. So what I'm going to do is I want one thing that's mapped the same. So I'm going to use place name so that it does match exactly what's in the JSON data. So if I leave place name alone, I can say, you know, I want a key called place name. And then the other ones I do have to map. And the way I map them is I use my property equal to whatever the JSON value is, or whatever the JSON property is. So my property is latitude equal to LAT. And longitude equal to LNG. And state is equal to admin name 1. That's my mapping. I'm looking at it on the TV and the font looks small, so I just blew up the font again. Okay. Then we should be able to create a container. I'm going to take the decoder and get a container keyed by my location keys. And it wants a type, so I'm saying .self. So again, if I can do that, so I don't have to deal with the optionals. So if I can create that variable from the decoder, then I want to grab the data. So I'm going to say container.decode. It wants a type. So my type, so let's say I'm trying to decode the place name. I know it's a string. So it's going to be string.self for key. And the key that I want, if I'm looking for the state, is just .state. So I should be able to say self.state equals. Doesn't want the type label, huh? So I just have to try this. And I'll do the same thing. It doesn't like that. Self dot place name equal to the same deal. So place name is also a string, so string dot self for key dot place name. Self dot latitude we have a double. And then longitude, same thing. I'm getting a bunch of errors, right? Because these initializers are in the if block, I'm not guaranteed to initialize them, so all of my paths have to result in those instance variables getting initialized. And I'm not guaranteed that because I'm in this try block. So I still have to initialize these. So I'm going to give initial values to the place name, Madison, self.latitude equal to 0, self.longitude equal to 0. And now those errors about initialization will go away. We were kind of debating where that location was, and we decided it's kind of in the Horn of Africa.
Yeah, it's up the southwest coast of the. Yeah. There's a name for that specifically. I think they call it like Null Island or something like that.
So I tried to look up those coordinates, and I couldn't get weather information from those coordinates.
It's over the middle of the ocean.
But there is a weather beacon there. Like if you look online, it says there's a weather station at those coordinates. I'm like,
yeah, it's called Null Island. It's the name for the area where the prime meridian and equator cross.
it had to be an IT guy,
Yeah,
right? Like naming it Null Island.
Yeah.
Okay. So ideally, what we would do is we'd come back over to the view controller. We have our data. We don't really want this string response. What we want to do is we want to decode this into a bunch of location information, right? So ideally, what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, I'm going to have a JSON decoder. And then I should be able to take that JSON decoder and decode my data. And if I look at this decode data, it really wants a couple of things. Like it wants me to tell what type I'm decoding it into. So like I'm simplifying things here, but I want to decode this data. And if I try to decode the data, like our first pass, I think our first pass would be I want to decode the data into a location object. So location.self, this data. And then I'd say, okay, here's my location information. Missing label. So I wanted the from the data. JSON decoder dot dec.
You have the class.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, there we go. And it's going to say, hey, this can throw an error, so we have to put it with a try. So yeah, let's fix that. And then we could put this conditional around it, right? If I can decode it, then print it. And we know that our location info, we're trying to convert our objects into these location objects. I'm printing the location info object, and I'm looking for cool location. Because when I decode this and I ask what the description is, I don't really have location information. I have this cool location because that's how I said that's what the description is. And what we're going to see, it's going to crash. Right? So if I run this right now, this decoding process is not as straightforward as last week. That's what we did last week, right? Essentially. So I click on this. Fatal error, try expression unexpectedly raised in error. If I look in here, no value associated with key. Admin name 1. Yeah, that's my state. Right? I have that mapped.
It's a nested map.
Yeah, it's a nested map, so I have problems. So I'm going to stop here for right now. So it's 6:38. Let's take a 10-minute break. 6:48, we'll come back, and then we'll deal with that nested mapping because it's not necessarily as straightforward as last week. So our decoding is more problematic this week. We don't just have a JSON object that we're mapping to a specific iOS object. Like our JSON object is not at the root level. It's nested, so we have to deal with that. And there's a couple of different ways to deal with it, but I think like I'll show you the solution tonight that I use all the time, but I could have nested enumerated types to talk about like that nested JSON. Like that gets more complicated, but you can do it. So let's break until 6:48, and then when we come back, we'll decode this.